Dr. Andrew Wakefield is an academic gastroenterologist. He received his medical degree from St. Mary's Hospital Medical School. He qualified as a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in 1985, and in 1996 was awarded a Wellcome Trust Traveling Fellowship. He recently authored the best-selling book, Callous Disregard. His topic is Autism and Vaccines, a research strategy focused on cause.
Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be here. What I'm going to do is reflect upon the experience of the last 20 years, looking at vaccine safety and autism in particular for the last 15 of those years, and really to how to take a relatively promising career and flush it down the toilet. I just want to take you back 15 years when I first got involved in autism, and this is with the mainstream view at the time. I'm not sure quite what the mainstream is, but this was their view, that it was a psychiatric disorder, that it was the parents' fault, the mother's fault, and in France they still believe to a large extent that it's the mother's fault, the refrigerator mothers, that it was a disease of constant prevalence, that it was not epidemic, that there was no rise in incidence, and this was an ancient disorder that hitherto had gone relatively unrecognized, that it was genetic, again blaming the parents, that it was not in any way environmental, and most specifically not due to environmental toxins. Children with autism usually manifest, according to Leo Kanner and his successors, from very early on. They did not demonstrate affection, they didn't want to be picked up, they never established eye contact or affection. And regression, that is the disappearance of a child who was developing normally, was extremely rare. There was no intestinal disease whatsoever. Diarrhea 12 times a day was to be expected in children with autism. Exclusion diets were bogus medicine, and there was no chance of recovery. Forget about it, put your child in a home, move on. There's nothing that you can do. It's not a psychiatric disorder, it's a medical disorder that manifests certain features in the brain that lead to behavioral and developmental problems. There is now undoubtedly an epidemic, so the mainstream view has changed. This is where we've come in 15 years. This is now the mainstream view, that there is an epidemic, and this is acknowledged by the CDC and many others, that genetics do not explain it. And rather like Yehuda said, what we're looking at here may well be a genetic predisposition to some environmental impact. But nonetheless, there have been no consistent, reproducible genome-wide scans or microsatellite array studies that have turned up anything that gives us cause to believe this is a simple genetic problem. It is environmental, and it is very likely, according to Dr. Landrigan from Mount Sinai Hospital, to be due to toxins in the environment. Regression has now become a very substantial part of autism. Regression, loss of skills in a normally developing or near normally developing child, to the extent that it's been included in the DSM, that there is undoubtedly an intestinal disease. It's something that we made up 15 years ago, but strangely it's been reproduced in 5 separate countries around the world now, and there is a consistent pathology in many of these children that I think is extremely interesting, give rise to the notion that there is an inflammatory process, a chronic inflammatory process in many of these children, and may somewhat iconoclastically be a primary lesion that leads to a secondary brain injury. The exclusion diets now, according to 2 randomized controlled clinical trials, are effective, and that recovery is possible. And the National Institutes of Health are now funding a study of recovered children. So parents are concerned that there is a huge inertia in this disorder, that it has not come very far within the time that they've had their children. They've seen them regress, but in fact a huge amount of progress has been made, albeit that it has been with some reticence because of the territorial imperative that this should be and remain a psychiatric problem. The mainstream view has also been that this regression of a child following exposure to a vaccine is coincidence. That is not medicine, that is witchcraft. You come to coincidence, the position of coincidence, after you've done diagnostic due diligence, after you've excluded every other possibility, you say this may be coincidence. If the child had natural chickenpox and regressed, which does happen, then you would pursue that to the ends of the earth to the extent you would develop a chickenpox vaccine, which we now have, of course. But if it's a vaccine, it must be coincidence. That vaccine safety is proven. No, it's not. Sorry, let me go back. How do I go back? Previous. that multiple studies confirm that there is no link, and I can deal briefly with that, and it's safe to receive multiple vaccines. As Paul Offit says, up to 100,000 vaccine antigens at one sitting. Now, this is a very interesting graph, and this came from the environmental health people, and this looks at the inflection of the incidence curves from different countries around the world. And it's a very interesting story. So we now have enough data on incidence to look at what happened before the incidence increased and what happened after. And this looks at the US, Japan in blue, the US, in fact, California in red, and Denmark in yellow, and then the cumulative data from around the world in the bottom graph. And you see there is this striking change, this hockey stick effect, which was analyzed accordingly before and after the regression, before and after the rise in incidence, and it occurred in these different countries around the world at a remarkable time point, at a time point which is the blinking of an eye in evolutionary terms, and that is in children, birth cohorts born at the end of the 1980s, in 2 years, the end of the 1980s, in these diverse populations, Japan, Denmark, and the US. And this is an extremely interesting graph, because what it allows us to do is to say, if this is environmental, what this helps us to do is to go back and pinpoint what environmental changes took place at that time that were common to these different countries that may have led to that inflection. Now, the most important thing of all is the parental history, and I can't stress this enough. And for scientists in the room, I once met a very eminent, extremely arrogant scientist from NIH who said, "Tell me all about this regressive autism and vaccines." And I started to say, well, the parent story is, he said, "I don't care about the parent story, give me the data." So it's very interesting you should say that. Let's say you go to the doctor and you say, look, I've had 3 episodes of rectal bleeding and my father had a colorectal cancer. And he says, don't tell me about that, I'm not interested, show me the data. The parent story is absolutely crucial. It is your starting point. If you do not start with the clinical history and examine the patient, you will go very, very badly wrong. And not do it once, but do it time and time and time again until patterns emerge, because medicine is about pattern recognition. And causation is complex, as we know. We've heard that many times. The story that I first heard, and therefore my starting point, was a regression in children following exposure to the MMR vaccine. That does not mean that I believe MMR vaccine causes all autism, or that other things are not involved, such as thimerosal. It was a starting point based upon the clinical history. Infection and disease is clearly not a simple relationship, depending upon your genetic makeup, the infectious exposure itself, and the timing of exposure. The age at which you get exposed to an infection is a major determinant of the outcome, but also playing into the environmental exposure is not just the infectious agent, but as we've heard time and time again, other factors, environmental factors, which influence the health and well-being of the individual, that turn that infectious agent into a pathogen. Etiologic synergy, this is the steppes of Outer Mongolia, and this, for the moment, let's say, is a ground squirrel. It's not, doesn't matter. The Moscow Institute of Ecology and Evolution studied this animal in great detail because it lives in its millions, its billions, in these steppes. And it carries in its throat the organism of plague, Yersinia pestis. And some of these animals in colonies live year on year with Yersinia pestis in their throat, and it causes them no trouble at all. Others die in epidemics of this disorder of plague. Why? Why? Same organism, same animals. So over a 16-year study, they tested the hypothesis that it was the metal content, the toxic metal content of the forage plants that these animals were eating, that determined whether that organism was a pathogen or not. And that's exactly what they found. So if you had a high load of adverse metal, of toxic metals such as cadmium, then that organism became a killer. If you had beneficial metals on board, such as zinc, then you were protected. And so you see this complex etiological interaction that is so important. Now, let me define what I think now may be happening in many of these children after many years of looking at this. I think we're looking at a compound risk. We're taking a developing immune system, and we are exposing it to known toxins, toxins to the nervous system, toxins to the developing immune system, and those include the preservatives thimerosal, and they include adjuvants like aluminum, or aluminium as I should have said, and in fact one of your papers just flashed up briefly there. And we are then adding in live viral vaccines, and what we are doing is influencing the ability of the developing immune system and or brain to respond as it should do appropriately to those infectious agents. So we put a live viral vaccine such as MMR in here, or we combine that with varicella, and we produce a synergistic or compound risk, which leads to a biohazard that is unpredictable and completely unknown. So if I take a patient and I give them 3 antihypertensive drugs at the same time, or I go to the FDA and say, I want to put these 3 antihypertensive drugs in combination, they'll throw me out, because every patient would die, because they have a synergistic interaction that would lead to a potentiation of adverse risk. And I believe that what we're producing here, by adding and adding and adding to the complexity of the vaccine schedule, amongst other things, a compound risk which we do not understand. Briefly on the bowel disease, this is the bowel disease from which these children don't suffer. This is a pill cam view. This is the telescopic, this is the camera that you swallow. It goes through your intestine, takes 3 frames a second, and here you see these focal inflammatory lesions throughout the small bowel with an ulcer here. This is rather like you would see in Crohn's disease. This is not Crohn's disease, but it may be, in some cases, a prodrome, which is very interesting. But this is not from me, it's not from Dr. Kriegsmann, it's not from John Walker-Smith. This comes from Dr. Balzola in Turin in Italy, which is one of the groups that has confirmed the reality of this disease. This is another image. This is a colonoscopy image taken from a child who was scoped by Dr. Kriegsmann. And what you see up here throughout this child's colon, and indeed throughout his gut, are these aphthoid ulcers, these small white areas, fibrinoid ulcers, right throughout his gut. And this child had suffered for many years with these. And when he was treated, he went from this, looking like a child from a famine zone in West Africa, to within 1 month of putting him on the appropriate anti-inflammatory therapy, to this. This is not difficult medicine. This is very, very straightforward, basic, standard clinical medicine. But what was interesting is that his autism also improved. It didn't recover, but he started speaking, he was affectionate, he regained skills. Is there a link between the gut and the brain in these individuals? So, how might that be operating? I do not know, but there are certain things which are both plausible and have some evidence for them. Dietary toxins, such as gluten and casein in the diet, whether they're working as toxins or promoting an aberrant immune response. Microbial byproducts, we've observed in certain clinical trials that children treated with neomycin, an antibiotic which is not absorbed from the gut, there is improvement, but only as long as the drug is kept going, and inflammatory cytokines. And I favor that in some respects. One of the most consistent findings in this disorder now, from studying intracellular cytokine profiles from the ileum and the colon and the peripheral blood, is this imbalance of interleukin 10 and TNF with a very high tumor necrosis factor alpha production by these cells, these CD3 lymphocytes, with a depression in this regulatory cytokine IL-10. So there, whatever it is, IL-1, TH1, TH2, whatever it may be, there seems to be an immune imbalance in these children that is even more marked than we see in children with Crohn's disease. And the other thing that I've handed out, which I won't be talking about today, but I include it because if anyone wants to read it, they're very welcome, and there are references in there. So I think that there may be an epicenter in the brain, which is in the brainstem itself, that is the origin of autism. And there's interesting work now in sporadic Parkinson's disease to suggest that the disease did not start in the substantia nigra, but actually starts in the brainstem and then through ascending pathways affect the substantia nigra. And I think that there's something like the dorsal vagal complex in the brainstem may also be a site, an epicenter of autism in many people. And there are reasons for that that are covered in that paper. So approaches to causation, which is really what I want to dwell on. What may alarm you, and what certainly alarmed me as a father of 4 children, is that the cumulative impact of the vaccine schedule has never been tested. What happens in the real world? This potential for synergistic interaction between different vaccines has never been tested. This is the schedule from the early 90s. And so some years ago, we decided to look at this. The World Health Organization recommendations to manufacturers for neurovirulence testing for example, measles vaccine goes as follows. You take 10 primates, and usually a rhesus macaque. You give them an intrathalamic injection of the vaccine antigen, not the vaccine, the measles virus antigen, not subcutaneously, but into the thalamus of the brain. You observe them for 17 to 21 days. And then you sacrifice them and do neuropathology to see if there's any problem. Now, in terms of an experimental protocol, it doesn't really get out of the starting block because they do not require any controls. So you cannot tell what the needle track or the saline that you might inject as a placebo does in the thalamus itself. If an animal dies in the first 48 hours, you can replace them in the study. It's not the vaccine's fault, it's the animal's fault. And if more than 20% of the animals die over the course of the whole study, you can scrap it and start again. And that is the basis of preclinical testing before it is then put into children. Not MMR, but the single measles antigen. That's it. Extraordinary. So we thought we could do better than that, and so we conducted a study which took place over 8 years with Laura Hewitson. This took place at the University of Pittsburgh. And the other thing about that study is it didn't require age specification. They could be adult monkeys. So we went back and we said, let us look at infant rhesus macaques giving an age and dose adjusted vaccine schedule as it was in the 1990s with thimerosal. Here is the study, birth to necropsy at the human equivalent of 8 years of age. The vaccine starting with hepatitis B vaccine at birth, and then on schedule up to their MMR vaccine, their preschool boosters, and then necropsy. We did multiple measurements on these animals, including laparotomy and biopsy before and after MMR vaccine, MRI and positron emission tomography looking at opioid receptor binding activity in the brain. And the reason I put this up there is an abundance of material available from this because so much was preserved that should people want to examine these tissues, these unique tissues, then they should contact Dr. Laura Hewitson to get those. So, multiple repeated measures of behavior and development, which are very well characterized in the rhesus macaque. We worked with the people at Pittsburgh who developed the tests over 40 years for looking at the cognitive and behavioral development of these animals' blood, urine, and stool specimens. Now, what I want to do is look at just the first 14 days, just the effect of the hepatitis B vaccine containing thimerosal. And what we did was to look at the survival reflexes. These are brainstem reflexes associated usually with feeding, such as rooting, sucking, snouting. And these are essential for the survival of these animals in the wild. If you can't feed after a day or two, you're going to die. So these are brainstem functions that should be acquired very early in life, and we're looking now just at the first 14 days. Not after that, because they got their second vaccine at 14 days. This is the first paper that came out, delayed acquisition of neonatal reflexes in newborn primates receiving a thimerosal-containing hepatitis B vaccine, also looking at gestational age and birth weight. Now, I won't go into great detail because these are published and you can get them, but this is rooting, sucking, and snouting reflexes here. And what we do, we look at this as a Kaplan-Meier survival curve, looking at the numbers, the proportion of animals left in the study over time along the bottom. These are the unvaccinated animals, and these are the vaccinated animals. And there is a significant delay in the acquisition of this reflex, which I think is snout, but I can't see, I think it's off the bottom. Sorry, root, it's a root reflex. Sorry? Is it aluminium adjuvant? This is the hepatitis B vaccine that was used in the early 1990s, so I think it probably is. But, you know. This is the suck reflex, gone off the top there, the same thing, and this is the snout reflex. So you see some of these animals failing to acquire these basic brainstem feeding reflexes right out to 8 days postpartum. Now, the one thing I would say about this study is had this been done at the time it should have been done by the people who should have done it, then that policy of neonatal hepatitis B vaccine would never have been approved. The second paper to come out of this, and I suspect there'll be about 10 to 15 papers coming out of the first phase, is looking at the brain growth, and you've heard about the large size of the brain in young children with autism and in the amygdala in particular. There is a differential growth and development of the amygdala in many children with autism, and so these are two areas that we looked at. Influence of pediatric vaccines on amygdala growth and opioid ligand binding in the rhesus macaque. Why opioids? Because you know, you've heard of the opioid excess hypothesis, that casein converted to casomorphine, gluten can turn into gliadomorphine, may be influencing brain growth. These are acting potentially as toxins. So we looked at opioid binding activity. This is the PET scan, this is the MRI scan, so that we could overlay these and do volume adjusted data. And what you see here is the unvaccinated animals, T1 before MMR, T2 after MMR, and you see this natural involution of the activity, the opioid binding activity in the amygdala. The brainstem is shown below. What you see in the animals that were vaccinated is that there was no attenuation of the signal. If anything, there was an increase in the signal. So there was a differential function in terms of opioid receptor binding between these animals. And the volumes of the brain, again, the volume changes in the brain and the amygdala mimic those that are described in autism. Does it make it autism? No, it doesn't. It makes it interesting. The conclusion, again, I won't dwell on that, but the conclusion is that had these studies been done when they should have been done, then the schedule itself would certainly be in question. They should have been done. Timing of exposure and risk. This is something else that the new charity that I've set up is going to look at. The influence of age upon the outcome from infection is a major determinant. If you get measles under the age of 1, your risk of developing subacute sclerosing panencephalitis is very much higher than if you develop it later. And this may well be, of course, due to the maturation of the immune system amongst other factors. This is important in as much that 2 papers have come now from Goodman and Gallagher from New York in these journals showing that hepatitis B series, the full vaccine schedule given to boys compared with unvaccinated boys leads to a 9-fold increased risk of special educational needs. And when looking specifically in a second paper at autism as an outcome, they showed that there was a 3-fold increased risk of autism in those who received their hepatitis B vaccine at less than 1 month, in other words, around 1 year, 1 day of age, compared to those who received it later. So age is important, and there appears to be an absolute risk for autism and developmental disorder associated with this thimerosal-containing hepatitis B vaccine. MMR, you've heard that the studies are all negative. No, they're not. And in fact, Dr. DeStefano from the CDC did a very good study where he looked at age of exposure to the vaccine to see if that was a determinant of risk of autism. And that's exactly what he found. He found that, and this is the paper here, that there was a significantly increased risk for those who had got the vaccine younger compared to those who got it older. And when he looked at those most recently born, then the risk went up to nearly 2.5. Why? Because the age of vaccination has changed. The mandate for MMR has come down from 15 to 12 months, and that would have the effect of putting more children in the at-risk group. Is that the reason? I don't know, but it's certainly consistent with what has happened over time. They put it down to an artifact of the vaccine requirements for special needs children. That would be only tenable if the vaccine requirements for special educational children were any different from those of regular ed children. They are not. It's a specious argument, and there are certain other papers that have come out since that have confirmed this same potential association between younger age of exposure and greater risk. What about the Somalis? We did some migration studies years ago in Crohn's disease that led us to want to look at the Somali population. Now, Crohn's is a very interesting example. The Somalis seem to be exquisitely sensitive to developing autism. There is no word for autism in Somalia, and yet when the Somali children are born as a first generation and beyond into the US or Sweden or the UK, they seem to be at an exquisite risk of this disorder. This is Crohn's disease. This was my early love, if that's not an odd expression. This is how I came into all of this as a gastroenterologist. It's undergone the same kind of change in prevalence and incidence as autism has, although it preceded it by some years. This is adult Crohn's disease, and then in the mid-60s we saw the emergence of pediatric Crohn's disease. We found that Indians in the Indian subcontinent had no Crohn's. But when they moved to the UK, the incidence of Crohn's in children born in the UK, Indian children born in the UK, was 6 times that of the indigenous population. This is an extraordinary observation. You see this migration phenomenon in multiple sclerosis, and here we were seeing it in Crohn's disease. Very low incidence of autism in those born in Somalia, very high incidence of those born in the West. And the data that we have comes from Sweden, the hard data. This has been looked at in 2 studies that shows there has gone from a 3 to 4 to 4 to 5-fold increased risk of this disorder in Somalis compared with the indigenous population. Why? Genes stay much the same. I say much the same, but the environment changes. Doesn't mean genes aren't important. but some in changing environmental exposure must be an important determinant of what's going on here. What else changes? Other possibilities. Is it a survival phenomenon? What I mean by that is the infant mortality much higher in Somalia? And is it possible that children who were at risk, had they survived, at risk of developing autism, then it would have appeared, but it didn't because they died. So are we looking at a survival phenomenon? Has survival improved by moving from Somalia to Western countries? In the more demanding environment of Somalia, are infants dying who, had they survived, might have developed autism? And the clues from Crohn's disease are here. This is a very interesting study, which is a standardized, it looks at incidence using exactly the same criteria of Crohn's in European countries. And what we found in this study is that there was this striking inverse relationship with infant mortality rate. So if you lived in a country with high infant mortality rate, there was virtually no Crohn's disease. And if you had very low infant mortality, then there was very high Crohn's disease. So it added to the idea that there may be a survival phenomenon. But the main determinants of survival and death in infants are infectious disease. So is this actually a proxy? Is it telling us something about the changing pattern of exposure to infectious disease? Infant mortality rates in the US are very low compared with Somalia, 6.4 per thousand compared with 110. So yes, there may be some survival phenomena here, but an alternative explanation, as I've said, is that the environmental exposures are different. So, infant mortality, an important marker of the effects of infectious disease, and therefore is this a reflection of the changing outcome from exposure to infectious disease? What other environmental exposures are important? Sunlight. We talked about vitamin D, very important because it's essential for normal T cell function, in particular regulatory T cell function. It's made in the liver and made into the active form in the kidneys, and what's interesting about vitamin D is that it is metabolized by cytochrome P450, some of the forms of cytochrome P450 in the liver. And this enzyme system, diverse as it is responsible for detoxification of drugs and the metabolism of vitamin D. And what's very interesting about the Somali population is they have this idiosyncratic, this very unusual cytochrome P450 system. There is great genetic variation in this activity, and what's interesting is that compared with the Caucasian population who have 0 of this ultra-rapid metabolizer status, 2D6, or Asian populations which have 0 of this, they have 30%. And this is unique to the Horn of Africa. And so is it possible that there is a genetic risk in this group that is encoded in cytochrome P450 that leads to degradation of vitamin D at an ultra-rapid rate? And would this contribute to an immunodeficiency? And is that, in turn, relevant to adverse vaccine reactions? And so, really, this is one of the hypotheses we want to test with the Somali population in the UK and with the Somali population in Minnesota. 30% of these ultra-rapid metabolizers in Somalia, adequate vitamin D levels because of sunshine, less intensive vaccination schedules, such as single measles, a very low autism risk, albeit that and a high, there should be another thing down here, it hasn't come up, high infant mortality rate, and are all of these playing in to a low incidence of autism. And compared with that, when you go, there it is, sorry, it's appeared now. When you go to Western countries, you retain 30% ultra-rapid metabolizer status, but now in Minnesota, inadequate vitamin D levels, particularly prevalent in dark-skinned individuals, intensive vaccination schedules, a low infant mortality, and therefore let's go on. And therefore a very high rate of this disorder. So that's a hypothesis that we hope to be examining. Now here's another clinical dilemma that we face, another study that we're going to be doing, and that is we have a number of children, when I was at Thoughtful House, where the older sibling had received an MMR vaccine and regressed into autism. Causation, I don't know, but that was the story. The child had developed bowel problems, autistic regression, and in early studies they had measles in their intestine by RT-PCR measured by Steve Walker at Wake Forest. The younger sibling, because the parent was concerned, did not get the vaccine, did not get MMR. But at some stage they started to lose skills or never gain them, developed the same gastrointestinal symptoms, and when they came to be scoped by Dr. Krigsman, they had the same bowel disease as their older sibling. So what's going on? Does that mean that the MMR has nothing to do with it at all? This is just one of those things. Horizontal transmission, and this is a dilemma that we are having to deal with at the moment. Measles vaccine is a live viral vaccine, and they're all derived originally from the Edmundston. This is the first individual for whom the virus was isolated in 1954. The virus replicates in the host, and therefore there is the potential for the vaccine virus to be shed, and this is seen with a number of vaccines, including rubella and polio. So, is spread to a non-vaccinated, non-previously exposed individual a concern? Thank you. Vaccine strains are all part of, there are 8 clades, and they're clade A viruses, and these all derived from the Edmundston wild-type virus. So if we are looking at outbreaks around the world and genotyping the virus, one can tell which of these clades they come from, and for example, whether episodes of vaccine-associated horizontal transmission or clinical symptoms are occurring. Okay, and this is just a worldwide outbreaks of clade A-associated virus. These are, and if we go backwards again, okay, a small number of clinical manifestations of measles worldwide in which strains similar to the vaccine strain were vaccine-related rather than being caused by persistently circulating wild-type virus. And so this is widely recognized and acknowledged by the virologists. And so what we have is a dilemma that if a child is persistently infected and, for example, is shedding virus in their diarrhea because they have an associated disease in their gut, is it possible that if they're going to then go on and infect a sibling, and if they do so, are they going to produce a similar type of disease, but of earlier onset, without the regression, depending on when they're exposed to that individual? We don't know. But what we do have, and what we did have, are these younger siblings. And what was striking about some is they were seropositive for measles virus IgG. They could only have been exposed in that way. There was no evidence of natural infection. There were no epidemics of measles at that time when they were born, or indeed in the States at all at that time. And when we went on to look at measles by RT-PCR in the gut, then there was evidence that the virus was there. So we have both seropositivity and a suggestion that the virus is there, plus the same disease. Does this suggest that there is horizontal transmission? And this is the view of the experts. This is a paper that comes from Putz et al. In the final stages of an eventual measles elimination, the reintroduction of a circulating vaccine strain which has lost attenuation could be a serious threat. And this is their perception now. Opinions may differ with respect to this potential threat in terms of the World Health Organization, but there is a consensus that development of a new measles vaccine cannot wait. Did you know that? I didn't know that. But apparently there's a consensus that we can't wait for a new measles vaccine. But in the clinical arena, there is a problem with which we have to deal. And what it means in terms of epidemiology is we have to rethink. Because if you have younger siblings who are not exposed by the natural route or not vaccinated, and yet they develop autism, they don't count as a control. Or if they're a close contact, they no longer count as a control. So we have to rethink how we approach epidemiological studies. And this is just one example. This is a Calamico-Geldy monkey at Brookfield Zoo in Chicago. These animals were vaccinated. They were then housed with unvaccinated animals. They developed some behavioral problems and diarrhea. And their cage mates went on to develop the same disease. Failure to thrive, behavioral disturbances. These tissues from these animals were submitted to pathologic and virologic examination. This is a Warthin-Finkeldy giant cell, a classic feature of measles virus infection, confirmed by immunohistochemistry and measles virus antigen detection at Loyola University, and sequencing of the vaccine strain-specific sequence. And then tissues taken from the animals who had not been vaccinated, who'd been caged with these animals, also developed these syncytia in cell culture, which were positive for measles virus. So is it a threat, or is it in fact a reality? So in summary, the kind of things that we have been looking at, and I'm no longer associated with this study, and for various reasons I'm not allowed to discuss the second phase of the study, but the second phase based upon the pilot study, which involved just under 20 primates, is underway. I'm not going to talk about it except to say that it is well underway. It's a very, very elaborate, extensive study, and tissues from that will be available, I think, in consultation with Dr. Laura Hewitson for examination. And so these are unique and very valuable materials. And for measles in particular, the rhesus macaque is a very good model of measles infection, unlike some of the other viruses we've heard about earlier. Studying migration phenomena in the UK and the US, looking at horizontal transmission or the potential for horizontal transmission as a confounder in epidemiological studies, but as a very important biological variable in vaccinology. And re-challenge, which I haven't mentioned, but is very important and was really introduced to the Institute of Medicine by Barbara in the case. So I think it was a diphtheria vaccine?
No, it was DPT.
It was, but didn't they put it down to a specific component of the vaccine? Don't worry. Okay. Well, what this refers to is taking a child or an individual who has developed a complication from the first exposure and then re-exposing them and observing either a deterioration in their condition, the same condition, or reactivation of the condition that they developed following the first exposure. And this, in terms of pharmacovigilance, is extremely, extremely good evidence of causation. And I've heard about it time and time again with the Gardasil vaccine. It seems to me that there are re-challenge events occurring with that. We looked at the bowel disease. We said, right, let's look at the bowel disease in children who regressed after MMR vaccine and compare it objectively and systematically in those children who got one vaccine and those children who went on to get 2 MMR vaccines, to ask the question, is it worse? On defined criteria such as neutrophilic inflammation, lymphocytic inflammation, granuloma, all these things, was it systematically worse? And yes, the answer is it was. This is objective evidence. It doesn't rely on parental history, which of course is open to criticism. So at least in a preliminary study conducted some years ago at the Royal Free and published in a very lowly journal, because at that time, as it is now, it is a taboo subject. But there is certainly evidence of a re-challenge effect at the pathological level. And this is something we want to examine also. So others. And I just wanted to mention in terms of the metals, maybe we've been asking the wrong question. And Needleman went a long way to proving that lead was dangerous by looking at, for example, teeth and hair and looking at IQ levels at a population level. Now, why didn't we do the same, or why don't we do the same with mercury or aluminum? Why don't we do that? Are we asking the wrong question, looking to see if it causes autism? Why don't we say, let's look at a population level at the IQ of these individuals? Not just take the autism population, take the whole population and look and see if there is an association between the levels in teeth and hair and the IQ of the population, because that's what led, at least in part, to the withdrawal of lead from petrol. So maybe we need to redefine the question to emulate what has been done by other people who've been successful in changing the way we see environmental toxicity. So thank you very much.